The first shell hit at 0347 hours. Close enough that Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez felt the concussion ripple through her chest cavity like a physical punch. In the pre-dawn darkness of the Korangal Valley, the explosion bloomed orange against the mountainside, illuminating the scattered remnants of what had been Alpha Company's forward observation post just 12 minutes earlier. Elena pressed her face deeper into the rocky outcropping that had become her sanctuary, feeling the grit of Afghan dust mix with the metallic taste of blood in her mouth where she'd bitten her tongue during the initial barrage. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Her radio crackled with static-laced voices, urgent and overlapping. Outpost 7, this is Firebase Charlie. We've lost contact with your position. Please respond. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Morrison. She recognized it even through the electronic distortion. Elena's fingers found the handset, but she hesitated, listening to the rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors somewhere in the distance, growing fainter by the second. The evacuation birds were leaving. They thought everyone was dead. Beside her, half buried under a slab of concrete that had once been part of the observation post's reinforced wall, Private Marcus Chen struggled to maintain consciousness. Blood seeped from a gash above his left eye, and his breathing came in short, painful gasps that suggested broken ribs. Elena had managed to pull him free from the larger debris, but moving him further risked internal injuries she couldn't assess in the darkness. His rifle lay twisted and useless 3 feet away, the barrel bent at an impossible angle. "Chen, stay with me," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant rumble of diesel engines. Through the gap in the rocks, she could see lights moving in formation down the valley. Enemy vehicles, at least a full mechanized platoon, maybe more. The timing of the attack had been too precise, too coordinated. This wasn't opportunistic Taliban harassment. This was a planned operation, designed to eliminate the observation post that had been calling in accurate fire missions for 3 weeks, disrupting supply routes and making life miserable for insurgent forces throughout the region. Elena's mission bag contained her most precious possessions: a laser rangefinder capable of marking targets for precision strikes, encrypted communication equipment that could reach artillery units 30 kilometers away, and a worn photograph of her sister Maria's wedding day. Maria had been 8 months pregnant in that picture, glowing with the kind of happiness that made Elena's chest tight with longing, even in peaceful moments. Now trapped behind enemy lines with wounded comrades, and surrounded by hostile forces, the photograph felt like a talisman against despair. The observation post had been Elena's home for 6 months. She knew every stone, every sightline, every dead space where an enemy might approach undetected. The position commanded a view of 3 major valleys, 2 confirmed weapons caches, and the main supply route that insurgents used to move equipment from Pakistan. It had taken her weeks to establish relationships with the local village elders, longer still to build the kind of trust that yielded actionable intelligence. All of that was gone now, reduced to smoking rubble and scattered equipment. But Elena was still alive, still operational, and still in possession of the tools needed to make the enemy's victory costly. She keyed the radio on a frequency she hoped the attackers wouldn't monitor. Any station, this is Falcon 7-7. I have eyes on target-rich environment, grid coordinates to follow. Be advised, friendly casualties at previous location need immediate medical evacuation when area is secure. The response came immediately, crisp and professional despite the early hour. Falcon 7-7, this is Thunderbase. We copy your transmission. What is your status and capability? Elena closed her eyes for a moment, calculating distances, angles, and ammunition types in her head the way other people might recall song lyrics. She had been the best forward observer in her training class, capable of adjusting fire to within 10 meters of her own position when necessary. But this would require something beyond textbook precision. This would require the kind of shooting that separated legends from statistics in military folklore. Thunderbase, I am approximately 200 meters northeast of previous position, concealed but with excellent observation. I count 18 vehicles in formation, moving northwest en route Falcon, mixed APCs and supply trucks. Requesting fire mission, high explosive and white phosphorus, danger close authorization. The pause that followed stretched long enough for Elena to hear her own heartbeat. Danger close meant artillery fire within 600 meters of friendly forces. Given her position, she was requesting strikes that would land close enough to shower her hiding spot with debris and superheated metal fragments. Falcon 7-7, confirmed danger, close authorization. You're calling fire on your own position. Elena looked at Chen, whose eyes had fluttered open and were now fixed on her face with an expression of trust that made her throat constrict. Behind them, Sergeant Williams was stirring beneath a pile of sandbags, alive but disoriented. 3 wounded soldiers, depending on her tactical expertise and steady nerves. The enemy convoy was spreading out now, preparing to sweep the area for survivors. In 10 minutes, maybe less, they would be discovered. Thunder Base, that's affirmative. Danger close authorized. I say again, danger close authorized. The mountains around the Korangal Valley had been carved by centuries of conflict, layers of history written in stone and blood. British forces had fought here during the colonial period. Soviet helicopters had burned on these ridgelines during the 1980s. American troops had been bleeding in these valleys for over a decade, learning the same harsh lessons about geography, determination, and the cost of underestimating an enemy's resolve. Elena understood that she had become part of this continuum, another link in a chain of soldiers who had faced impossible choices in impossible places. Her great-grandfather had fought in World War II, island hopping across the Pacific with the Marine Corps. Her father had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a helicopter door gunner. Military service was a family tradition, but more than that, it was a calling that Elena had felt since childhood. She remembered being 12 years old, watching news coverage of the September 11th attacks with her parents, feeling something crystallize in her chest that would eventually lead her to this moment, this place, this decision. The radio crackled again. Falcon 7-7, we have your coordinates. First rounds will be high explosive. Time on target in 90 seconds. Keep your heads down. Elena pressed the handset to her lips, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Copy, Thunderbase. 90 seconds. Falcon 7-7 out. She turned to Chen and Williams, both of whom were now conscious and watching her with expressions that mixed fear, admiration, and absolute trust. Incoming friendly fire in 90 seconds. Stay low, stay pressed against the rock face, and whatever happens, don't move until I give the all clear. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of diesel exhaust and burning rubber from the convoy below. Elena could hear voices now, speaking in languages she couldn't identify but with tones that were universally military. Sharp commands, acknowledgments, the organized chaos of troops preparing for combat operations. They were close enough that she could make out individual soldiers dismounting from vehicles, spreading into tactical formations. Elena checked her watch. 60 seconds remaining. She closed her eyes and thought about Maria's wedding, about the sound of laughter echoing through the church hall, about the way her sister's face had glowed with joy and anticipation. She thought about her parents, probably drinking coffee in their kitchen in San Antonio right now, unaware that their daughter was about to become either a hero or a casualty statistic. She thought about the young soldiers under her protection, trusting her expertise to keep them alive through the next few minutes. When she opened her eyes, the convoy had stopped directly below her position. Soldiers were deploying in textbook formation, moving with the kind of disciplined coordination that suggested professional military training rather than insurgent enthusiasm. Elena felt a chill of recognition. These weren't local Taliban fighters. These were foreign advisors, possibly Chechen or Pakistani special forces, equipped with modern weapons and tactical knowledge that made them exponentially more dangerous. 30 seconds. Elena keyed her radio to report these observations to the Special Operations team, but her transmission was interrupted by the sound of approaching aircraft. Looking up, she saw 3 helicopters moving in formation toward her position, flying low and fast in a tactical approach pattern that suggested immediate danger. Her radio crackled with an urgent transmission from Reaper 26. Falcon 7-7, be advised we have reports of enemy air defense systems activating in your area. Recommend immediate displacement to alternate position. Elena grabbed her equipment and began moving toward her secondary observation post, a position she had prepared for exactly this contingency. But as she moved through the rocky terrain, she caught sight of movement in the valley below that made her freeze in place. Enemy forces were deploying in a coordinated search pattern, moving with the kind of systematic precision that suggested they had been tracking her position. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Someone had been monitoring her radio transmissions and providing enemy forces with accurate intelligence about her location and activities. The sophisticated attack on Outpost 7, the precise timing of enemy movements, and now the coordinated response to her fire missions all pointed to a security breach that compromised American operations throughout the region. Elena found cover behind a large boulder and assessed her situation with the kind of analytical clarity that training and experience had developed. She was alone, surrounded by enemy forces who knew her approximate location and operating with communications that were clearly compromised. Her survival depended on skills and knowledge that couldn't be taught in schools or simulated in training exercises. But Elena also realized that her discovery of the security breach represented intelligence that was potentially more valuable than any target coordinates she could provide. If enemy forces had penetrated American communications networks, similar compromises probably existed in other sectors, placing countless soldiers at risk and undermining the effectiveness of ongoing operations. Elena switched her radio to an emergency frequency that was used only for the most critical communications, and employed encryption protocols that would be difficult to monitor. Her transmission was brief and coded in language that would be meaningful to intelligence professionals, while remaining opaque to casual listeners. Thunderbase, this is Falcon 7-Seven with priority intelligence concerning network security. I have evidence of communication compromise, affecting operational planning and force protection. Request immediate contact with Sierra Elements for detailed debrief. The response came immediately, indicating that her transmission had triggered automatic alerts within the intelligence community. Falcon 7-Seven, Thunderbase. Confirm you have evidence of communication compromise. What is the nature and scope of your information? Elena looked down at the enemy forces moving through the valley below, noting their deployment patterns and coordination procedures. They were operating with real-time intelligence that could only have come from monitoring American radio networks, possibly including encrypted channels that were considered secure. Thunderbase, enemy forces are responding to my activities with detailed knowledge of target locations, timing, and coordination procedures. They're tracking my movements and anticipating my actions in ways that suggest access to operational planning information. The pause that followed was longer than usual, suggesting consultation with higher authority and analysis of the implications Elena had identified. When the response came, it carried a tone of urgency that confirmed the significance of her discovery. Falcon 7-Seven, your intelligence has been forwarded to appropriate agencies. Continue reporting enemy activities and maintain position security. Specialized support elements are being tasked to your location. Elena acknowledged the transmission and began moving toward her tertiary position, a location that she had never revealed to higher command and had developed using her own resources and judgment. If communications were indeed compromised, she needed to assume that all of her reported positions were known to enemy forces. As she moved through terrain that had become as familiar as her childhood neighborhood, Elena reflected on the complexity of modern warfare and the challenges facing soldiers who operated in environments where information was as important as ammunition. The technical advantages that American forces typically enjoyed could be neutralized by adversaries who understood how to exploit network vulnerabilities and communication dependencies. But Elena also understood that her current situation, desperate as it appeared, provided unique opportunities to gather intelligence that might not be available through conventional collection methods. Her isolation behind enemy lines, combined with her intimate knowledge of local terrain and enemy patterns, placed her in position to observe activities that would normally remain hidden from American surveillance assets. Elena reached her final observation position as the sun climbed higher in the eastern sky, illuminating the valley with harsh light that made concealment more difficult but also improved visibility for observation and targeting. She established communications with the Special Operations Team and began providing detailed reports on enemy movements, equipment, and coordination procedures. The intelligence picture that emerged from her observations was more complex and troubling than previous assessments had indicated. Enemy forces in the region were not isolated insurgent groups, but components of a sophisticated network that included professional military advisors, advanced communications equipment, and tactical doctrine that rivaled American capabilities. More importantly, Elena observed evidence of coordination between groups that intelligence assessments had identified as separate and potentially hostile to each other. Tribal factions that were supposed to be fighting among themselves were instead cooperating in operations against American forces, suggesting that traditional strategies based on exploiting local divisions were no longer effective. Elena's radio crackled with updates from Reaper 2-6, reporting that specialized support elements were en route to her location but would require several hours to navigate the complex terrain and coordinate with supporting units. In the meantime, she was directed to continue intelligence collection while maintaining position security and avoiding direct engagement with enemy forces. But as Elena monitored enemy activities throughout the afternoon, she became aware that her situation was becoming increasingly precarious. Search teams were moving through the area and expanding patterns that would eventually discover her position regardless of how well concealed it might be. The enemy had demonstrated sophisticated intelligence capabilities and would likely employ all available resources to locate and eliminate the observer who had been calling in accurate fire missions. Elena faced a decision that would determine not only her own survival but the value of the intelligence she had gathered. She could attempt to evade capture by moving to a more distant position, but doing so would limit her observation capabilities and reduce the accuracy of the intelligence she could provide. Alternatively, she could maintain her current position and continue providing detailed reports until she was discovered, accepting the likelihood of death or capture in exchange for maximum intelligence value. The choice was made easier by a radio transmission from Reaper 2-6, reporting that American forces in adjacent sectors were under attack and requesting immediate intelligence support to coordinate defensive operations. Elena's position provided the only real-time observation of enemy movements in the Central Valley, making her reports essential for force protection and tactical coordination. Elena keyed her radio and made a commitment that reflected her understanding of military service and professional responsibility. Reaper 2-6, Falcon 7-7. I'm staying in position to provide continuous intelligence support. Be advised that my position may be compromised within the next few hours. The response showed the kind of professional respect that Elena had earned through months of accurate reporting and tactical expertise. Copy, Falcon 7-7. Your intelligence has been invaluable. What support do you need to maintain operations? Elena looked at her remaining supplies and calculated how long she could sustain operations without resupply or reinforcement. Her situation was deteriorating rapidly, but she still had sufficient resources to provide meaningful intelligence for several more hours. Reaper 2-6. I'm currently self-sufficient for continued operations. Priority request is for artillery support if my position is overrun. I'll designate targets and provide fire control until the end. Elena spent the remaining daylight hours documenting enemy positions, movement patterns, and communication procedures in detailed reports that would provide American forces with unprecedented insight into adversary capabilities and intentions. Her observations revealed tactical innovations, leadership structures, and operational planning methods that conventional intelligence collection had failed to identify. As darkness approached, Elena prepared for what might be her final night behind enemy lines. Enemy search teams were moving closer to her position, and the sophisticated communication intercept capabilities they had demonstrated suggested that they would eventually triangulate her location regardless of her operational security measures. But Elena felt a sense of professional satisfaction that transcended personal safety concerns. She had accomplished her mission with a level of expertise and dedication that honored the trust placed in her by military training and the faith shown by soldiers who depended on accurate intelligence for their survival. Whatever happened in the coming hours, she had made a difference that would extend far beyond her individual fate. Elena settled into her final defensive position and began the process of preparing for close combat that might determine whether the intelligence she had gathered would reach the people who could use it effectively. Her radio remained active, providing real-time updates on enemy movements and tactical assessments that would guide American operations throughout the region. The radio crackled one final time before Elena imposed communication silence to avoid detection. The message was brief but carried the weight of institutional recognition and professional respect. Falcon 7-7, this is Thunder 6. Your reporting has saved countless American lives and provided intelligence that will guide operations for months to come. Whatever happens, know that your service has made a difference that will be remembered. Elena acknowledged the transmission and settled into the patient watchfulness that would define her final hours in the Korangal Valley. The stars appeared overhead, brilliant in the clear mountain air, and she found herself thinking about Maria's wedding day, about her parents, Kitchen in San Antonio, about the choice she had made to serve something larger than individual comfort or safety. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted her reflection, and Elena prepared for the confrontation that would determine whether she would see those stars again. But she felt no fear, only the calm satisfaction of someone who had performed her duty with honor and expertise, regardless of the personal cost. Elena had not always been a soldier. There was a time, not so long ago, when her biggest concerns involved college entrance exams and whether Kevin Martinez would ask her to junior prom. Growing up in San Antonio's East Side, she had been the quiet one in a family of extroverts, the daughter who preferred books to parties and spent her free time tinkering with electronics in the garage workshop her father had built behind their small frame house. Her mother, Carmen Vasquez, worked double shifts at Methodist Hospital as a surgical technician, coming home each night with stories of lives saved and lost, of split-second decisions that determined whether families remained whole or shattered. Elena would listen to these stories while helping prepare dinner, learning about precision, responsibility, and the weight that came with holding someone's life in your hands. These conversations, more than any recruitment poster or patriotic speech, had planted the seeds of her eventual military service. Maria had been the golden child, 3 years older and blessed with the kind of effortless charm that made teachers smile and boys stumble over themselves to carry her books. She had married her high school sweetheart, settled into a comfortable life in the suburbs, and seemed destined for the kind of happiness that Elena watched, with a mixture of admiration and restlessness. At family gatherings, relatives would pat Elena's shoulder and ask when she planned to follow her sister's example, find a nice boy, settle down. But Elena had dreams that didn't fit into conventional expectations. She wanted to see mountains that weren't visible from Texas highways, wanted to test herself against challenges that couldn't be solved with textbook knowledge or good intentions. When her high school counselor suggested she consider the military as a pathway to college funding, Elena found herself researching not just educational benefits, but mission statements, deployment schedules, the kinds of specialized training that would transform her from a shy teenager into something harder and more capable. Her father, Roberto, had initially opposed the idea. He had seen enough of war during his own service in Vietnam, had lost too many friends to combat and too many more to the slower violence of drugs and alcohol and untreated trauma. But Elena persisted with the same quiet determination that had carried her through advanced placement courses and state math competitions. She presented her arguments logically, methodically, wearing down his resistance with facts and figures and the kind of respectful stubbornness he recognized as inherited from his own mother. Basic training at Fort Leonard Wood had been a revelation. For the first time in her life, Elena found herself surrounded by people who shared her appetite for challenge, who understood the satisfaction that came from mastering complex systems under pressure. She excelled at land navigation, weapons marksmanship, and tactical communications. Her drill sergeants noted her potential early, recommending her for advanced training that would eventually lead to Forward Observer School. But it was during her first deployment to Iraq that Elena truly discovered her calling. Assigned to a cavalry squadron operating in Anbar province, she had been responsible for coordinating fire support for mounted patrols moving through insurgent-controlled territory. The work required split-second calculations, absolute accuracy, and the kind of calm focus that came naturally to someone who had grown up solving problems methodically and thoroughly. Elena remembered her first danger close-fire mission with crystalline clarity. A patrol had been ambushed in the narrow streets of Ramadi, pinned down by machine gun fire from multiple positions. The platoon leader, a young lieutenant named Davidson, had been wounded in the initial contact. Command and control had devolved to a staff sergeant who was brave but inexperienced with indirect fire procedures. Elena had been monitoring the radio traffic from a position 3 kilometers away, safe behind the thick walls of a forward operating base. But as the situation deteriorated and casualties mounted, she had made a decision that would define the rest of her military career. Without authorization from higher command, she had grabbed her equipment and convinced a helicopter crew to insert her into the fight. Landing under fire in a debris-strewn courtyard, Elena had quickly established communication with the trap patrol and begun the process of identifying enemy positions through careful observation and radio coordination with the embattled soldiers. The enemy had chosen their ambush site well, using buildings and narrow alleyways to create interlocking fields of fire that made movement deadly and evacuation impossible. But Elena had seen something the enemy commanders missed: a water tower that provided both concealment for the insurgent positions and structural weakness that could be exploited. Instead of calling for conventional high-explosive rounds that might collapse buildings onto the trapped soldiers, she had requested white phosphorus rounds targeted at the tower's base supports. The result had been spectacular and decisive. The collapsing tower had crushed 2 machine gun positions while creating enough smoke and confusion to allow the patrol to withdraw to safer positions. More importantly, Elena's actions had saved the lives of 7 wounded soldiers who might otherwise have died waiting for conventional reinforcement. The incident had earned her a Bronze Star and, more significantly, the respect of combat veterans who understood the difference between textbook tactics and battlefield innovation. But it had also changed something fundamental in Elena's relationship with her family and her former civilian life. During her leave between deployments, Elena had found herself struggling to connect with old friends whose concerns seemed trivial compared to the life-and-death decisions she faced regularly in combat zones. Conversations about television shows, relationship drama, and career advancement felt hollow and meaningless. She would catch herself calculating fields of fire in restaurants, identifying escape routes in shopping malls, assessing strangers as potential threats or assets. Maria had noticed the change immediately. During a family barbecue, she had cornered Elena in the kitchen and demanded to know what had happened to her little sister who used to laugh at silly jokes and cry during romantic movies. Elena had tried to explain about responsibility, about the weight of making decisions that kept people alive, about the satisfaction that came from excelling at something that truly mattered. But the words had sounded hollow even to her own ears, inadequate to bridge the growing gap between her military identity and her civilian roots. The transition back to deployment had actually been a relief. In Afghanistan, surrounded by soldiers who shared her experiences and understood her priorities, Elena could function without constantly translating her thoughts into civilian-friendly language. She could focus on the mission without apologizing for her intensity or explaining her dedication to people who had never faced genuine life-or-death consequences. But the isolation was real and growing deeper with each deployment. Elena found herself forming close bonds with fellow soldiers that would inevitably be severed by rotation schedules, casualties, or simple geographic separation. She had learned to care deeply about people she might never see again, to invest emotionally in relationships that were temporary by design. Private Chen had been assigned to her team fresh from advanced individual training, eager and competent but lacking the seasoned judgment that came from extended combat experience. Elena had taken special interest in his development, recognizing something of her younger self in his methodical approach to problem-solving and his genuine concern for mission success. Over the months at Outpost 7, she had watched him mature from an anxious replacement to a confident soldier who could be trusted with increasingly complex responsibilities. Sergeant Williams represented a different kind of relationship, built on mutual professional respect and shared combat experience. He had served multiple tours in both Iraq and Afghanistan, accumulating the kind of practical knowledge that couldn't be taught in schools or simulated in training exercises. Elena valued his counsel and appreciated his willingness to defer to her technical expertise, while providing the kind of leadership experience that kept young soldiers focused and motivated. These relationships, forged under extreme conditions and tested by shared danger, had become more meaningful to Elena than many of the civilian connections she had maintained through letters and emails. The bonds formed by mutual dependence and professional trust created a kind of intimacy that transcended typical friendship, approaching something closer to family loyalty. Now pressed against the rock face with enemy forces searching for survivors, Elena felt the full weight of that responsibility. Chen and Williams were depending on her technical skills and tactical judgment to keep them alive long enough for rescue. Their trust was absolute and unconditional, based on months of shared experience and demonstrated competence under fire. But Elena also felt the deeper isolation that came with command responsibility. The decisions she made in the next few hours would determine not just her own survival, but the fate of 2 soldiers who had placed their lives in her hands. The burden was familiar but never comfortable, a weight that she carried with growing expertise but never diminishing awareness of its significance. She thought about her sister's wedding photograph, now creased and stained with dust but somehow still intact in her equipment bag. Maria had looked so happy that day, so confident in her choices and optimistic about her future. Elena wondered if she would ever experience that kind of uncomplicated joy. If the skills and experiences that made her valuable in combat would translate into civilian happiness, or simply ensure that she remained forever separate from the peaceful world she had volunteered to defend. The radio crackled with updates from Thunder Base, confirming that medical evacuation helicopters were en route but would need time to navigate the complex terrain and coordinate with supporting aircraft. Elena acknowledged the transmission and began the process of preparing her wounded teammates for extraction, checking their injuries more thoroughly now that immediate danger had passed. Chen's head wound appeared worse than it was, bleeding freely but showing no signs of concussion or skull fracture. Williams had suffered a separated shoulder and multiple lacerations but was conscious and increasingly alert as shock wore off. Both soldiers were transportable and likely to make full recoveries with proper medical attention. But the mission was far from complete. During her months of observation at Outpost 7, Elena had identified multiple enemy weapons caches, supply routes, and command positions that remained viable targets. The successful destruction of the convoy represented a tactical victory, but strategic objectives required continued operations against infrastructure and leadership elements that had not yet been engaged. Elena keyed the radio and requested updates on available fire support, ammunition status, and planned operations for the coming hours. The responses confirmed what she had already suspected. Higher command was treating the attack on Outpost 7 as an isolated incident, rather than part of a larger campaign. They were focused on casualty evacuation and position abandonment, rather than exploitation of the intelligence she had gathered and the targeting opportunities that remained available. This disconnect between tactical reality and strategic planning was a constant source of frustration for forward-deployed soldiers who understood local conditions better than staff officers operating from secure headquarters hundreds of kilometers away. Elena had seen similar situations during her Iraq deployment, where valuable intelligence and targeting opportunities were wasted because higher command lacked the situational awareness to recognize and exploit battlefield advantages. But Elena also understood that her perspective, shaped by months of continuous observation and analysis, represented only one small piece of a much larger operational puzzle. Decisions about resource allocation, risk assessment, and strategic priorities were made by commanders who had access to intelligence sources and operational considerations that remained invisible to soldiers at her level. The tension between local knowledge and strategic planning was one of many contradictions that defined modern military service. Elena had learned to accept these frustrations as inherent to the profession she had chosen, focusing on executing her assigned missions with maximum competence while advocating for the tactical insights that ground-level experience provided. As she waited for medical evacuation and prepared for the next phase of operations, Elena found herself thinking about the conversation she would eventually have with her sister about this deployment, about the challenge of explaining experiences that had no civilian equivalent. How could she describe the satisfaction of calling perfect fire missions, the burden of making life and death decisions for other people, the isolation that came from expertise in violence that peaceful society found both necessary and disturbing? These were questions without easy answers, part of the ongoing challenge of maintaining connections to a civilian world that felt increasingly distant and irrelevant. But they were also questions that Elena knew she would continue wrestling with for years to come, part of the price of choosing a profession that demanded everything and offered rewards that could never be adequately explained to people who had not paid the same price. The sound of approaching helicopters interrupted her reflection, rotor noise echoing off the valley walls in a rhythm that promised rescue and medical attention for her wounded teammates. But for Elena, the sound also represented a transition point, a moment when she would need to shift from immediate survival concerns to longer-term operational planning and strategic decision-making that would determine the success or failure of her extended mission behind enemy lines. The medical evacuation helicopter touched down in a swirl of dust and rotor wash that temporarily obscured Elena's vision and filled her mouth with the familiar taste of Afghan grit. She guided the medics to Chen and Williams, providing rapid casualty reports, while her eyes continuously scanned the surrounding ridgelines for signs of enemy movement. The helicopter crew worked with practiced efficiency, loading the wounded soldiers onto stretchers and establishing intravenous lines, while the aircraft's weapons systems remained trained on potential threat areas. "Hey, Sergeant Vasquez, you're coming with us," shouted the flight medic over the engine noise. He was young, probably on his first deployment, and his expression showed the kind of determined competence that Elena recognized from her own early military experience. Elena shook her head and stepped back from the aircraft. "Negative, I'm staying. Mission's not complete." The pilot, a chief warrant officer with the weathered face of someone who had spent years flying in hostile airspace, leaned out of his cockpit window. "Ma'am, higher command wants you extracted with your team. This position is being abandoned." Elena felt a familiar surge of frustration at decisions made by people who didn't understand the tactical situation. She pulled out her map case and approached the pilot's window, speaking loudly enough to be heard over the turbine engines. "Sir, I've got eyes on 3 weapons caches and 2 command bunkers that weren't hit in the initial strike. This terrain gives me observation on the entire supply route network. If I leave now, we lose 6 months of intelligence development." The pilot's expression showed understanding mixed with sympathy. He had probably faced similar situations before, caught between tactical reality and strategic directives from higher headquarters. "I understand your position, Sergeant, but I've got direct orders to extract all personnel from this area. The entire valley is being designated a free fire zone." Elena's mind raced through the implications. Free fire zone designation meant that artillery and airstrikes could be called in without regard for friendly forces on the ground. It was an admission that the military had decided to abandon the intelligence network she had spent months developing in favor of indiscriminate destruction that would drive enemy forces deeper underground without eliminating their operational capability. "Give me 5 minutes to make a radio call," Elena requested. The pilot checked his watch and nodded reluctantly. "5 minutes. Then we're gone with or without you." Elena moved away from the helicopter and switched her radio to the frequency used for direct communication with battalion headquarters. The response came immediately, crisp and professional despite the early morning hour. "Thunderbase, this is Falcon 7-7 requesting to speak with Thunder 6. "Falcon 7-7, Thunder 6 is not available. This is Thunder 3. What's your request?" Elena recognized the call sign as belonging to the battalion operations officer, a major who had the authority to make tactical decisions but not the field experience to understand their implications fully. She chose her words carefully, knowing that this conversation would likely determine whether months of intelligence gathering would be wasted. "Thunder 3, Falcon 7-7, I'm requesting permission to remain in position for continued observation and target development. I have identified high-value targets that will be lost if this area is designated Free Fire Zone." The pause that followed stretched long enough for Elena to hear the helicopter engines changing pitch as the pilot prepared for takeoff. When the response came, it carried the tone of someone reading from prepared text rather than making an independent decision. "Falcon 7-7, you are directed to proceed to Extraction Point Alpha for immediate evacuation. Your area of operation is being redesignated. Higher command has determined that continued human intelligence operations in your sector carry unacceptable risk." Elena felt her jaw clench with the familiar frustration of military bureaucracy overriding tactical effectiveness. She tried once more, knowing that her words would likely be ignored, but feeling obligated to make the attempt. "Thunder 3, be advised that enemy forces in this area have been using coordinated tactics suggesting professional military training. The attack on our position was precisely timed and executed with knowledge of our operational patterns. This indicates intelligence capability that won't be degraded by artillery strikes alone. Copy your assessment, Falcon 7-7. However, higher command has made their decision. You are directed to comply with extraction orders immediately." Elena stared at the radio handset for a moment, weighing her options. Disobeying direct orders would end her military career and potentially result in court-martial proceedings. But abandoning the intelligence network she had developed would waste months of dangerous work and allow enemy forces to reconstitute their operations without interference. The helicopter pilot was making throat-cutting gestures now, indicating that his patience was exhausted and safety considerations required immediate departure. Elena made a decision that would define the remainder of her military service. "Thunder 3, Falcon 7-7, I'm experiencing communication difficulties. Say again your last transmission." Elena switched off her radio and walked back to the helicopter, her expression neutral despite the turmoil in her thoughts. The pilot leaned out of his window with an expectant expression. "What's the word, Sergeant?" Elena looked at Chen and Williams, both now stabilized and ready for transport to definitive medical care. Their trust in her judgment had been absolute and well placed. Now she was about to violate that trust by choosing mission accomplishment over personal safety. "Sir, I need you to tell higher command that I was killed in action during the initial attack. My body was destroyed beyond recovery when the ammunition dump exploded." The pilot's eyes widened with understanding and alarm. "Sergeant, I can't report false casualty information. That's a federal crime." Elena pulled out her identification tags and pressed them into the pilot's hand. "Then don't report anything. Just tell them you couldn't locate my body in the rubble. Let them draw their own conclusions." The flight medic, who had been listening to this exchange with growing concern, stepped forward. "Ma'am, you can't stay here alone. You'll be killed or captured within hours." Elena shouldered her equipment pack and checked her weapons one final time. "Maybe, but the intelligence I've developed here is worth more than one soldier's life. If I can degrade enemy operations for even a few more days, it might save dozens of lives in future engagements." The pilot made one final attempt to change her mind. "Sergeant, even if you survive the next few hours, how are you planning to get home? This entire valley is going to be crawling with enemy forces looking for survivors." Elena smiled grimly and gestured toward the ridgelines that surrounded their position. "Sir, I've been studying this terrain for 6 months. I know every trail, every hiding spot, every water source within 50 kilometers. If anyone can evade capture long enough to complete this mission, it's me." The helicopter crew exchanged glances that mixed admiration with concern. They were all professional soldiers who understood the concept of mission first, but they also understood the difference between calculated risk and suicide missions. Elena stepped back from the aircraft and gave a crisp salute. "Take care of my boys, sir. And tell higher command that the intelligence I'm developing will be transmitted through alternative channels." The pilot returned her salute and began increasing engine power for takeoff. Elena moved to a safe distance and watched as the helicopter lifted off, carrying Chen and Williams away from immediate danger and toward medical attention that would save their lives and restore their health. As the aircraft disappeared over the eastern ridgeline, Elena felt the profound isolation that came from being truly alone in hostile territory. But she also felt a sense of purpose and professional satisfaction that had been missing from her recent deployments. For the first time in months, she was operating without bureaucratic constraints or conflicting guidance from higher command. Her mission was clear, her resources were adequate, and her expertise was perfectly suited to the challenges ahead. Elena spent the next hour moving carefully through the ruins of Outpost 7, salvaging equipment and supplies that would be essential for extended operations behind enemy lines. Her priority items included batteries for her radio equipment, additional ammunition for her rifle, medical supplies for treating minor injuries, and enough rations for 3 days of operation. But more importantly, she recovered the detailed maps and observation logs that represented months of painstaking intelligence development. These documents contained precise coordinates for weapons caches, supply routes, command bunkers, and meeting areas that enemy forces believed were secret. They also included psychological profiles of local leaders, assessments of tribal loyalties, and analysis of communication patterns that could be exploited to predict enemy movements. As Elena organized her equipment and prepared for movement to her primary observation position, she reflected on the series of decisions that had led to this moment. Each choice had seemed logical and necessary at the time, but together they had created a trajectory that separated her from conventional military operations and placed her in a position of extraordinary independence and responsibility. The destruction of the enemy convoy had been a tactical success, but it had also revealed the sophistication of the forces arrayed against American operations in this sector. The coordinated timing of the attack, the precision of the artillery barrage, and the professional deployment of troops suggested that enemy commanders had access to intelligence sources and tactical expertise that exceeded previous assessments. Elena's radio crackled with transmissions from other units operating in adjacent sectors, reports of increased enemy activity and coordinated attacks on isolated positions. The pattern suggested a broader offensive designed to eliminate American intelligence-gathering capabilities and force withdrawal from areas that had been under observation for extended periods. But Elena also heard something else in the radio traffic: confusion among friendly forces about enemy capabilities, outdated intelligence assessments that underestimated the sophistication of opposition tactics, and coordination failures that allowed enemy forces to achieve tactical surprise. These were problems that could be addressed through better intelligence, more accurate targeting, and tactical advice from observers who understood local conditions. Elena keyed her radio on a frequency that she knew was monitored by Special Operations Forces operating in the region. These units had the authority and capability to act on intelligence without requiring approval through conventional command channels. Any Reaper station, this is Falcon 7-7 with priority intelligence for immediate exploitation. The response came within seconds, indicating that Special Operations Forces were indeed monitoring communications in the area. Falcon 7-7, this is Reaper 2-6. What's your status and location? Elena provided a brief summary of her situation, emphasizing her continued operational capability and access to high-value intelligence that could support immediate tactical operations. The response showed the kind of professional interest that she had hoped to generate. Falcon 7-7, Reaper 2-6, we understand you're supposed to be evacuated. What's your actual status? Elena chose her words carefully, knowing that this conversation was probably being monitored by multiple agencies and would likely be reviewed by investigators at some point. Reaper 2-6, I became separated from evacuation elements during enemy contact. I am currently mission-capable and in possession of time-sensitive intelligence. The pause that followed suggested consultation with higher authority before the response came. Falcon 7-7, we're interested in your intelligence. Can you provide target coordinates for immediate action? Elena smiled for the first time since the attack began. Special Operations Forces understood the value of actionable intelligence and had the resources to exploit opportunities quickly and effectively. This was the kind of support that could make her decision to remain behind enemy lines worthwhile. Reaper 2-6, affirmative. I have coordinates for 3 weapons caches and 2 command bunkers. All targets are within range of precision fires and currently undefended. Elena spent the next 20 minutes providing detailed target descriptions, recommended ammunition types, and suggested timing for maximum effectiveness. The Special Operations team responded with the kind of professional competence that made complex operations look effortless, confirming target coordinates and coordinating with available fire support assets. As Elena waited for the strikes to begin, she moved to her primary observation position, a concealed location that provided excellent visibility of the target areas, while offering multiple escape routes if her position was discovered. The location had taken her weeks to develop, requiring careful camouflage work and stockpiling of supplies that would support extended operations. The first strike hit exactly on schedule, a precision missile that turned the largest weapons cache into a pillar of fire and smoke visible throughout the valley. Secondary explosions suggested that the cache had contained more ordnance than Elena's previous estimates indicated, validating her assessment of enemy capabilities and intentions. The second and third strikes followed in rapid succession, each impact precisely targeted to achieve maximum destruction, while minimizing the risk of collateral damage to civilian structures. Elena watched through her binoculars as enemy personnel responded to the attacks with the kind of disciplined reaction that confirmed their professional military training. But she also observed something that troubled her. The enemy response included communications equipment and coordination procedures that suggested direct connection to higher command structures. These weren't isolated cells operating independently, but components of a larger network that could adapt quickly to changing tactical situations. The first enemy soldier appeared at the edge of Elena's position just after midnight, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that his quarry was both dangerous and desperate. Elena watched through her night vision scope as he signaled to unseen companions, indicating that he had found traces of her presence but not her exact location. She had perhaps minutes before they would discover her hiding place among the rocks and scrub vegetation that had concealed her throughout the day. Elena made a final radio transmission on the emergency frequency, speaking in barely audible whispers that would be difficult to detect but clear enough to convey essential information. Thunderbase Falcon 7-7. Enemy forces have located my position. Transmitting final intelligence package now. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. She activated a data burst transmission that would upload everything she had observed during her time behind enemy lines. Detailed maps, marking weapons caches and supply routes, psychological profiles of enemy leadership, analysis of tactical doctrine and communication procedures, and most importantly, evidence of the security breach that had compromised American operations throughout the region. The upload completed just as Elena heard movement directly above her position. She looked up to see an enemy soldier silhouetted against the starlight, his rifle trained in her direction. For a moment they stared at each other across a distance of perhaps 10 feet, each calculating angles and options with the kind of tactical awareness that separated veterans from casualties. Elena's training took over, muscle memory developed through countless hours of practice overriding conscious thought. She rolled sideways while bringing her rifle to bear, firing 3 precise shots that dropped the enemy soldier before he could alert his companions. But the sound of gunfire would draw others, and Elena's position was now thoroughly compromised. She grabbed her essential equipment and began moving toward an escape route she had prepared for exactly this contingency. But as she emerged from her hiding place, Elena found herself face to face with a second enemy soldier who had been approaching from an unexpected direction. This one was older, more experienced, and had positioned himself to block her primary escape route. They fired simultaneously, muzzle flashes illuminating the darkness like deadly strobes. Elena felt a bullet crease her left shoulder, spinning her sideways but not disabling her shooting arm. Her return fire caught the enemy soldier's center mass, dropping him instantly, but also revealing her position to other searchers, who were closing in from multiple directions. Elena pressed herself against a large boulder and assessed her tactical situation with the kind of clinical detachment that training had instilled. She was wounded but mobile, armed but outnumbered, and trapped in terrain that offered limited concealment and fewer escape routes. Her chances of survival were minimal, but she still possessed information and capabilities that could inflict significant damage on enemy forces. She keyed her radio one final time, broadcasting on multiple frequencies to ensure that her message would be received by someone who could act on the intelligence she was providing. Any station, this is Falcon 7-7 with final fire mission. Grid coordinates follow. Danger close. My position. Execute immediately. Elena provided precise coordinates for the area surrounding her position, knowing that the artillery strike would likely kill her, along with the enemy forces that were converging on her location. But she also knew that eliminating this particular enemy unit would disrupt operations that threatened American forces throughout the region. The response came from Thunder Base, the voice tight with emotion but professionally controlled. Falcon 7-7, we copy your coordinates. Time on target, 90 seconds. Are you certain about danger close authorization? Elena looked around at the enemy soldiers who were now visible in multiple directions, moving with tactical precision toward her position. She thought about Chen and Williams, safely evacuated and receiving medical attention. She thought about the intelligence she had gathered and transmitted, information that would save American lives and improve operational effectiveness. She thought about her choice to remain behind enemy lines and the consequences that choice had made inevitable. Thunder Base, I'm certain. Execute fire mission. Tell my family I did my job. Elena switched off her radio and prepared for the final confrontation of her military career. She had 1 magazine of ammunition remaining, perhaps 30 rounds that she would use to maximum effect in the time remaining before the artillery strike arrived. Her shoulder wound was bleeding but manageable, and her shooting skills remained unimpaired despite the stress and fatigue of extended operations. The first enemy soldier to approach her position moved with the cautious confidence of someone who believed he had cornered wounded prey. Elena waited until he was close enough to guarantee a lethal shot, then fired twice before shifting position to engage the next target. Her movement drew return fire that chipped rock fragments from the boulder protecting her, but the enemy shooters were firing blind in darkness while Elena retained the advantage of night vision equipment. Elena continued fighting with methodical precision, conserving ammunition while making each shot count. She had been trained for exactly this scenario, the final stand of an isolated soldier facing overwhelming odds, but she had never expected to feel the strange sense of peace that accompanied her realization that she was performing exactly as her training intended, dying in service to something larger than individual survival. The artillery strike arrived with perfect timing and devastating accuracy. Elena felt the ground shake beneath her as high explosive rounds impacted all around her position, creating a maelstrom of fire and metal that eliminated enemy forces, while somehow leaving her alive in a pocket of space, protected by the massive boulder that had provided cover throughout her final firefight. When the explosions stopped and the dust settled, Elena found herself wounded but conscious, surrounded by the devastation that her final fire mission had created. The enemy search team had been eliminated, along with their radio equipment and any intelligence they might have gathered about her activities or location. Elena's radio crackled with urgent transmissions from Thunder Base, requesting status reports and confirmation of her survival. She keyed the handset with trembling fingers, her voice hoarse from dust and smoke but clearly audible. "Thunder Base, Falcon 7-7, I'm alive, mission complete." The response came immediately, filled with relief and professional admiration. "Falcon 7-7, medical evacuation is en route. Hang tight, we're coming to get you." Elena leaned back against the boulder that had saved her life and looked up at the stars that were now visible through the smoke and dust. She thought about the intelligence she had gathered and transmitted, about the security breach she had identified, about the enemy capabilities she had documented. Her mission had been successful beyond her original objectives, providing information that would influence American operations for months to come. But Elena also thought about the cost of that success, measured not just in her own wounds and trauma, but in the relationships and connections that had been strained or severed by her choices. She had proven herself as a soldier and intelligence collector, but at the expense of the civilian life and family connections that had once provided meaning and comfort. The sound of approaching helicopters interrupted her reflection, rotor noise that promised medical attention and extraction to safety. Elena attempted to stand, but found that her injuries were more extensive than she had initially realized. In addition to the shoulder wound, she had suffered multiple lacerations and what felt like a concussion from the artillery strike that had saved her life. But she was alive, functional, and in possession of intelligence that had already begun influencing American operations throughout the region. Her radio reports during the final hours had provided real-time intelligence that enabled friendly forces to anticipate and counter enemy movements, saving lives and improving tactical effectiveness. As the evacuation helicopter landed and medics rushed to her position, Elena felt the kind of professional satisfaction that came from missions accomplished despite overwhelming obstacles. She had performed her duties with distinction, honored the trust placed in her by military training, and contributed to the larger effort in ways that would extend far beyond her individual service. The flight medic, a different soldier than the one who had evacuated Chen and Williams, worked quickly to stabilize her injuries while asking questions about her medical history and current symptoms. Elena answered automatically, while her mind processed the transition from combat operations to medical care, from isolation to human contact, from immediate danger to relative safety. "Ma'am, you're going to be fine," the medic assured her as he worked to control bleeding and assess the extent of her injuries. "You've got some fragments to dig out and some stitches to put in, but nothing that won't heal properly with time and rest." Elena nodded but found herself thinking about different kinds of healing, psychological and emotional recovery that would be more complex than treating physical wounds. She had spent days behind enemy lines in conditions of extreme stress, making life-and-death decisions while isolated from normal support systems. The transition back to conventional military life would require adjustments that couldn't be addressed with medical procedures or rehabilitation exercises. As the helicopter lifted off and began the flight toward medical facilities, Elena looked down at the Korangal Valley one final time. The terrain that had been her home and battlefield for months was now illuminated by fires started during the artillery strikes, marking the destruction of enemy positions and the successful completion of her extended mission. But Elena also saw the villages and farming areas that would continue to be affected by military operations, the civilian population caught between competing forces and conflicting loyalties. Her intelligence had been valuable for military purposes, but the human cost of ongoing conflict remained a burden that she would carry long after her physical wounds healed. Elena's radio crackled with a transmission from Thunder Base, providing updates on how her intelligence was being used to guide ongoing operations. Enemy weapons caches had been destroyed, supply routes had been interdicted, and coordination networks had been disrupted based on the information she had gathered and transmitted. More importantly, the security breach she had identified was being investigated by specialized teams with the capability to trace communication compromises and implement countermeasures. Her discovery had potentially saved hundreds of American lives by revealing vulnerabilities that enemy forces had been exploiting for months. The helicopter crew maintained professional medical protocols during the flight, but Elena could see in their expressions the kind of respect that combat veterans reserved for soldiers who had performed exceptional service under impossible conditions. Her actions during the previous 72 hours would become part of unit folklore, stories told to future soldiers about dedication, expertise, and the kind of courage that emerged from thorough preparation and absolute commitment to mission success. As they approached the medical facility where she would receive definitive treatment, Elena thought about the reports she would need to write, the debriefings she would attend, the administrative processes that would document her experiences for future analysis and training development. Her mission behind enemy lines had generated intelligence that would influence doctrine, tactics, and operational planning for years to come. But Elena also thought about the letter she would write to Maria, the phone call she would make to her parents, the challenge of explaining experiences that had no civilian equivalent. How could she describe the satisfaction of calling perfect fire missions while acknowledging the cost of violence and destruction? How could she discuss professional accomplishment while addressing the isolation and trauma that accompanied combat service? These were questions that Elena would wrestle with during her recovery and beyond, part of the ongoing challenge of integrating military experiences with civilian identity and family relationships. But they were also questions that reflected the complexity of military service in an era when professional excellence required personal sacrifices that couldn't be easily explained or understood by people who had not made similar choices. The helicopter touched down at the medical facility with the kind of controlled precision that Elena associated with military professionalism. As medics transferred her to a stretcher and wheeled her toward emergency treatment, she felt the transition from active combat operations to medical recovery, from tactical decision-making to surrender of control to medical professionals. Elena's final conscious thought, before anesthesia took effect, was about the photograph of Maria's wedding that had somehow survived the artillery strike and remained intact in her equipment bag. The image represented connections that transcended military service, relationships that provided meaning beyond professional accomplishment, and the civilian life that waited for her beyond recovery and rehabilitation. Elena awakened in a hospital bed 3 days later, her left arm immobilized in a sling and her head wrapped in bandages that made her look like a combat casualty from a war movie. The room was sterile and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos and noise that had defined her recent experiences. Sunlight streamed through windows that offered a view of mountains that looked similar to those in Afghanistan but felt fundamentally different. Safer, more civilized, touched by the kind of peace that came from effective governance and established law. The first visitor was Colonel Martinez, the brigade intelligence officer who had reviewed Elena's reports and understood their significance better than most. He entered the room with the bearing of a career officer who had seen enough combat to recognize exceptional performance when he encountered it. His expression combined professional respect with genuine concern for Elena's physical and psychological recovery. "Sergeant Vasquez, how are you feeling?" the colonel asked, settling into a chair beside her bed with the careful movements of someone who understood that hospital visits could be as traumatic as they were comforting. Elena shifted carefully, testing the limits of her injuries while organizing her thoughts for what she knew would be an important conversation. "Sir, I'm functional. What's the status of the intelligence I transmitted?" Colonel Martinez smiled, recognizing the priorities that drove Elena's question. "Your intelligence has been invaluable, Sergeant. The security breach you identified led to a complete overhaul of our communication protocols. 3 enemy networks have been disrupted based on your targeting information. Most importantly, the tactical insights you provided have been distributed throughout the theater and are already saving lives." Elena felt the satisfaction that came from mission accomplishment, but she also felt the weight of questions that couldn't be answered with tactical success or professional recognition. "Sir, what's my status? Am I facing disciplinary action for remaining behind enemy lines without authorization?" The colonel's expression became more serious, reflecting the complexity of Elena's situation within military command structures that valued both mission accomplishment and adherence to orders. "Officially, you experienced communication difficulties that prevented you from receiving extraction orders. Unofficially, higher command understands that your decision to remain in position was tactically sound and strategically valuable." Elena nodded, understanding the diplomatic language that allowed military bureaucracy to acknowledge exceptional performance while maintaining official procedures and command authority. She had expected this response and felt relieved that her career would survive her decision to prioritize mission accomplishment over personal safety. "There's more, Sergeant," Colonel Martinez continued. "Your actions during this deployment have generated significant attention at the highest levels of command. You're being recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross, and there's discussion about accelerated promotion and assignment to specialized units that could benefit from your expertise. Elena listened to this information with mixed emotions. Professional recognition was gratifying, but she also understood that such attention would likely lead to assignments that involved even greater isolation from civilian life and family relationships. Success in military service often came at the cost of connections that provided meaning beyond professional accomplishment. Sir, I appreciate the recognition, but I need time to think about my future. This deployment has been challenging in ways that extend beyond the tactical situation. Colonel Martinez nodded, with the understanding of someone who had seen many exceptional soldiers struggle with the transition from combat operations to peacetime service. Take all the time you need, Sergeant. The military will be here when you're ready to make decisions about your future. Elena's next visitor was Captain Morrison, the medical officer responsible for her treatment and recovery planning. She was a woman approximately Elena's age, with the kind of professional competence that inspired confidence while maintaining appropriate therapeutic distance. Sergeant Vasquez, your physical injuries are healing well, but I'm more concerned about the psychological impact of your experiences. 72 hours behind enemy lines under those conditions would be traumatic for anyone. Elena had expected this conversation and had spent considerable time during her recovery thinking about the psychological effects of her recent experiences. Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but I feel remarkably stable given what happened. I made decisions that I'm comfortable with, and I accomplished objectives that I consider important. Captain Morrison made notes on Elena's chart while continuing the assessment that would determine her fitness for continued military service. That's encouraging, Sergeant, but psychological trauma often manifests in subtle ways that become apparent only after soldiers attempt to resume normal activities. I'm recommending counseling sessions that will help you process your experiences and develop strategies for long-term adjustment. Elena agreed to the counseling recommendation while privately wondering how military psychologists could understand experiences that had no civilian equivalent. How could someone who had never called artillery fire on their own position assess the psychological impact of such decisions? How could therapeutic techniques developed for peacetime trauma address the complexity of emotions that accompanied exceptional performance under extreme conditions? Elena's first phone call home was to Maria, who answered on the second ring with the kind of immediate availability that suggested she had been waiting for contact. Elena's sister's voice carried relief mixed with concern, emotions that reflected the difficulty of loving someone whose profession involved regular exposure to mortal danger. Elena, thank God you're safe. Mom and Dad have been worried sick. We saw news reports about fighting in your area, but the military wouldn't tell us anything specific about your situation. Elena chose her words carefully, knowing that her family deserved honesty while understanding that complete transparency about her experiences would likely create more anxiety than comfort. I'm fine, Maria. I was involved in some operations that kept me out of communication for a few days, but everything worked out well. I should be home on leave within the next few weeks. Elena, you sound different. Are you sure you're okay? Elena paused, recognizing that her sister's intuition had detected changes that Elena herself was still processing. The experiences of the past week had affected her in ways that would probably take months or years to fully understand. But she also felt confident that these changes represented growth rather than damage. I'm different, but I'm okay. This deployment has taught me things about myself and my capabilities that I'm still processing, but I'm proud of what I accomplished, and I'm looking forward to seeing everyone when I get home. Elena's conversation with her parents followed a similar pattern, with carefully chosen words that conveyed reassurance while acknowledging that her experiences had been significant. Her father, with his own military background, seemed to understand the subtext that Elena couldn't express directly. Her mother focused on practical concerns about medical care and recovery timeline. But Elena also noticed that these conversations felt different than previous communications with her family. The gap between her military experiences and civilian life had widened to the point where meaningful communication required constant translation, careful selection of which details to share and which to omit. She loved her family deeply, but she also felt the isolation that came from expertise in violence and decision-making under extreme pressure. Elena's physical therapy sessions provided structure and goals that helped organize her recovery process. The therapist, a former military medic who understood the mentality of soldiers recovering from combat injuries, focused on restoring full range of motion and strength while acknowledging the psychological benefits of physical challenges and measurable progress. Sergeant, your injuries were significant but not permanently disabling. With consistent effort, you should regain full function within 3 to 4 months. The question is whether you want to return to active duty or consider medical retirement. Elena had been wrestling with this decision since awakening in the hospital. Her recent experiences had demonstrated her exceptional capabilities as a forward observer and intelligence collector, but they had also highlighted the personal costs of military service that involved extended deployment and exposure to combat conditions. Home Boden's Han, I'm not ready to make that decision yet. Can we focus on full recovery and see how I feel about future service once I'm physically and psychologically ready? The therapist agreed, understanding that career decisions made during recovery often reflected temporary emotional states rather than long-term professional goals. Elena had time to consider her options while focusing on the immediate challenges of healing and readjustment to peacetime routines. Elena's counseling sessions with the military psychologist proved more valuable than she had initially expected. Dr. Sarah Kim was a former military officer who had transitioned to psychology after her own combat experiences, bringing understanding of military culture and the unique stresses that accompanied exceptional performance under extreme conditions. Sergeant Vasquez, your psychological profile indicates remarkable resilience and adaptive capacity. Your decisions during this deployment were tactically sound and psychologically healthy given the circumstances you faced. Elena felt relief at this assessment while continuing to explore the emotional complexity of her recent experiences. Ma'am, I'm comfortable with the decisions I made, but I'm struggling with the isolation that seems to accompany military expertise. The better I become at my job, the harder it becomes to maintain relationships with people who haven't shared similar experiences. Dr. Kim nodded with recognition of a common challenge facing career military personnel. That's a perceptive observation, Sergeant. Military service at your level requires specialized knowledge and psychological attributes that can create barriers to civilian relationships. But those same qualities also enable you to form exceptionally strong bonds with fellow service members who share your experiences and understand your perspective. Elena spent several sessions exploring this tension between military excellence and civilian connections, gradually developing strategies for maintaining family relationships, while accepting that some aspects of her experiences would remain incomprehensible to people who had not made similar choices. 6 weeks after her evacuation from the Korangal Valley, Elena received orders for temporary duty at the Army War College, where she would assist in developing training programs based on lessons learned from her recent deployment. The assignment represented recognition of her expertise while providing time and space to consider her long-term career goals. The War College environment offered Elena the opportunity to interact with senior officers and defense analysts who understood the strategic significance of her tactical experiences. Her insights about communication security, enemy capabilities, and the importance of human intelligence collection influenced curriculum development and tactical doctrine in ways that would affect military training for years to come. But Elena also discovered that her experiences had applications beyond military service. Defense contractors and private security companies expressed interest in her expertise, offering civilian positions that would utilize her skills while providing better compensation and more predictable schedules than continued military service. Elena found herself at a crossroads that would define the remainder of her professional life. She could continue military service with the likelihood of promotion and assignment to increasingly specialized and demanding positions. She could transition to civilian employment that would utilize her military skills while providing more conventional work-life balance. Or she could pursue education and career development that would open entirely different professional opportunities. The decision was complicated by Elena's growing understanding that her identity had been fundamentally shaped by military service in ways that couldn't be easily separated from her personal relationships and life goals. She was no longer the young woman who had enlisted to pay for college and see the world. She had become a professional warrior with specialized knowledge and psychological attributes that set her apart from civilian society, while connecting her to a military community that understood her experiences and valued her contributions. Elena's final decision came during a visit from Chen and Williams, both of whom had recovered from their injuries and been assigned to new units. Their reunion was emotional and meaningful, reinforcing the bonds that had been forged under extreme conditions and tested by shared danger. "Sergeant, we heard about your assignment to the War College," Chen said as they sat in the hospital cafe, sharing coffee and stories about their respective recovery experiences. "That's outstanding recognition for everything you accomplished." Elena smiled, feeling the warmth that came from recognition by people whose opinions mattered most to her. "Thanks, Chen. But I'm more interested in hearing about your new assignments and how you're adjusting to life outside the Korangal Valley." Williams, characteristically direct, asked the question that Elena had been asking herself for weeks. "Sergeant, are you staying in the Army? Because if you are, I'd like to request assignment to your next unit. After what we went through together, I can't imagine working with anyone else." Elena felt the weight of responsibility that came from other people's faith in her leadership and expertise. Her decision would affect not just her own future, but the careers and development of soldiers who had learned to trust her judgment under the most demanding conditions. "I'm staying in," Elena said, surprised by the certainty in her voice. "This is what I'm good at, and there are still things I want to accomplish. But I'm also going to work on maintaining better connections with my family and civilian life. I think it's possible to be exceptional at military service, while also remaining connected to the world we're serving to protect." Elena's decision to continue military service came with new understanding of the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. She would likely face assignments that were increasingly demanding and isolating, but she would also have opportunities to influence military doctrine, train future soldiers, and contribute to national security in ways that few people could match. More importantly, Elena had learned that exceptional performance under extreme conditions could coexist with meaningful relationships and personal growth. Military service had changed her in fundamental ways, but those changes represented development rather than damage, strength rather than limitation. Elena's recovery period concluded with a promotion ceremony that recognized her exceptional service while marking the transition to new responsibilities and challenges. As she stood at attention while the citation for her Distinguished Service Cross was read aloud, Elena thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment and the paths that lay ahead. The photograph of Maria's wedding remained in her possession, now joined by pictures of Chen and Williams and other soldiers whose lives had been touched by her service. These images represented connections that transcended professional accomplishment, relationships that provided meaning beyond tactical success, and the human bonds that made military service worthwhile despite its costs and challenges. Elena's story was far from complete, but she faced the future with confidence in her abilities, clarity about her values, and determination to continue serving with honor while maintaining the relationships that made such service meaningful. The mountains of Afghanistan had tested her in ways she could never have imagined, but they had also revealed strengths and capabilities that would guide her through whatever challenges lay ahead. 3 years later, Captain Elena Vasquez stood at the podium of the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, addressing a classroom filled with young officers who would soon deploy to combat zones where the lessons she had learned might determine their survival and mission success. The PowerPoint presentation behind her displayed satellite imagery of the Korangal Valley, terrain that had become both battlefield and classroom during 72 hours that changed her understanding of warfare, leadership, and personal responsibility. The key insight from Operation Highland Viper, Elena told her audience, is that modern warfare requires soldiers who can adapt tactical doctrine to local conditions while maintaining strategic perspective and psychological resilience. Technology provides capabilities, but human judgment determines how those capabilities are employed. The students, most of them recent graduates of the Officer Candidate School, listened with the kind of intense attention that suggested they understood the practical value of Elena's experiences. Many of them would face similar challenges within months, leading soldiers in complex environments where tactical mistakes could have strategic consequences, and individual decisions could affect the lives of entire communities. After the lecture, Elena was approached by Lieutenant Sarah Chen, younger sister of the soldier who had shared her ordeal behind enemy lines. Sarah had requested assignment to Elena's advanced course, specifically because of stories her brother had told about leadership under extreme conditions. "Ma'am, Marcus told me that you saved his life not just through tactical expertise but through the kind of leadership that inspired confidence even when the situation seemed hopeless. I want to learn how to provide that kind of leadership for my own soldiers." Elena smiled, recognizing the family resemblance and remembering the trust that Marcus had placed in her judgment during their darkest hours. Lieutenant, your brother's survival depended as much on his own courage and competence as on anything I did, but I'm happy to work with you on developing the skills and mindset that effective leadership requires. Elena's assignment at Fort Leavenworth represented the kind of career progression that rewarded exceptional field performance with opportunities to influence doctrine and training development. But the position also provided stability that allowed her to rebuild relationships with family and maintain connections to civilian life that had been strained by repeated deployments and the psychological demands of combat service. Her apartment near the base was decorated with photographs that told the story of her journey, graduation pictures from officer candidate school, deployment photos with her teams in Iraq and Afghanistan, family gatherings during leaves, and formal portraits from award ceremonies. But the most prominent image remained the photograph of Maria's wedding, now professionally framed and displayed on her mantle as a reminder of relationships that transcended military service. Elena's evening routine included video calls with her family, conversations that had evolved from carefully edited summaries of deployment experiences to more honest discussions about the challenges and rewards of military service. Her parents had gradually developed understanding of her career choices, while Maria had become an advocate for military families within her own community. "Elena, I've been thinking about what you said during your last visit," Maria said during one of their weekly conversations, "about the importance of civilians understanding what military service actually requires. I started volunteering with a support group for military spouses, and I'm amazed by how little most people know about the reality of deployment and combat service." Elena felt gratitude for her sister's efforts to bridge the gap between military and civilian communities, understanding that such connections were essential for maintaining the democratic values that military service was intended to protect. "Maria, that work is incredibly important. Military families need support from people who understand the unique challenges they face." Elena's relationship with her parents had also deepened through honest conversations about the generational differences in military service and the evolution of warfare since her father's experience in Vietnam. Roberto had initially struggled to understand the complex ethical and tactical challenges that characterized modern counterinsurgency operations, but he had gradually developed appreciation for the expertise and judgment that contemporary military service required. "Mija, when I was in Vietnam, we knew who the enemy was and what we were supposed to accomplish," Roberto had told Elena during her last leave. "Your generation faces much more complicated situations where success requires understanding politics, culture, and psychology as much as tactics and weapons." Elena valued these conversations because they helped her articulate the complexity of modern military service while maintaining connections to family members who provided perspective and support that couldn't be found within military communities. The balance between professional expertise and personal relationships remained challenging, but Elena had learned that both were essential for long-term psychological health and career satisfaction. Well, Elena's work at Fort Leavenworth focused on developing training scenarios that would prepare future officers for the kind of complex decision-making that characterized modern warfare. Her experiences behind enemy lines had provided insights into adaptive leadership, resource management, and psychological resilience that were difficult to simulate in conventional training environments. Working with a team of educational specialists and experienced officers, Elena developed case studies that challenged students to think beyond tactical procedures and consider the broader implications of their decisions. The scenarios incorporated elements of her own experiences while avoiding details that might compromise operational security or traumatize students who had not yet faced combat conditions. The goal, Elena explained to her colleagues, is to develop officers who can maintain moral and tactical clarity under extreme pressure while adapting their approach to local conditions and unexpected challenges. "We want to build decision-makers, not just tacticians." Elena's influence on military education extended beyond formal classroom instruction. She frequently spoke at professional conferences, contributed articles to military journals, and consulted with defense contractors developing new technologies for forward observers and intelligence collectors. Her reputation within the military community opened doors to opportunities that would have been impossible for officers without similar combat experience and demonstrated expertise. But Elena was also careful to maintain perspective about her role within the larger military institution. Her experiences, however dramatic and influential, represented only one small part of a vast organization that required contributions from thousands of people with different skills and backgrounds. Humility about her place within this larger structure helped Elena avoid the arrogance that sometimes affected officers whose combat achievements received significant recognition. 5 years later, Major Elena Vasquez completed her final inspection of the Forward Observer course that she had designed and implemented at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. The program represented the culmination of 8 years of experience distilled into curriculum that would train the next generation of soldiers responsible for coordinating artillery and air support in complex operational environments. The students graduating from Elena's course demonstrated proficiency in technical skills that exceeded previous standards, while also showing the kind of adaptive thinking and ethical reasoning that modern warfare demanded. They understood not just how to call for fire, but when such calls were appropriate, how to minimize civilian casualties while maximizing military effectiveness, and how to maintain psychological resilience under conditions of extreme stress. Ladies and gentlemen, Elena addressed the graduating class during their completion ceremony. You are assuming responsibility for capabilities that can save friendly lives and accomplish essential missions, but you are also accepting the burden of making decisions that will affect civilians, allies, and adversaries in ways that extend far beyond immediate tactical situations. Use your skills wisely, maintain your integrity, and never forget that the ultimate purpose of military force is to create conditions for peace. Among the graduating students was Sergeant Michael Williams, son of the soldier who had shared Elena's ordeal in the Korangal Valley. Michael had grown up hearing stories about his father's deployment and Elena's leadership, eventually choosing military service with the specific goal of training under the officer who had saved his father's life. "Ma'am, my father always said that you taught him the difference between surviving and succeeding under pressure," Michael told Elena after the ceremony. "I hope I can live up to the standard you've set." Elena felt the weight of generational responsibility, understanding that her influence would extend through the soldiers she trained to their own subordinates and the missions they would eventually lead. Military service involved a chain of mentorship and example that connected past, present, and future in ways that transcended individual careers and achievements. Elena's personal life had also evolved in ways that surprised her with their conventional happiness. She had married Colonel David Rodriguez, a fellow officer whose own combat experience included multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. Their relationship was built on mutual understanding of military culture, shared professional values, and appreciation for the challenges that career military service imposed on personal relationships. Though trolls, their wedding had been a military ceremony that honored tradition while celebrating the kind of partnership that made demanding careers sustainable. Maria had served as maid of honor, their father had walked Elena down the aisle in his dress uniform from Vietnam, and their mother had cried tears of joy that reflected years of worry finally transformed into pride and relief. "Elena, I never thought I'd see you in a wedding dress," Maria had said during the reception, "but I'm so happy that you found someone who understands what you need and appreciates what you've accomplished." Elena and David's marriage was sustained by shared understanding of deployment cycles, career progression requirements, and the psychological demands of leadership positions that involved life and death decisions. They supported each other through the challenges of military life while maintaining individual professional identities and career goals. 8 years later, Lieutenant Colonel Elena Vasquez accepted command of the 1st Battalion, 17th Field Artillery Regiment, becoming one of the youngest officers and few women to lead a unit responsible for providing fire support across multiple theaters of operation. The ceremony took place at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, with family members, former teammates, and senior officers in attendance to witness the culmination of a career marked by exceptional performance and innovative leadership. During her change of command speech, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought her from a young forward observer in Iraq to battalion command responsible for hundreds of soldiers and sophisticated weapons systems capable of precise effects across vast distances. "Military service has taught me that individual excellence means nothing without team success, that tactical expertise must be guided by strategic wisdom, and that the ultimate measure of leadership is the development of subordinates who exceed their leaders' capabilities," Elena told the assembled audience. "I am honored to command soldiers who represent the finest traditions of the field artillery, while preparing for challenges that will require innovation, adaptation, and unwavering commitment to the values that define American military service." Elena's battalion would deploy to Africa within 6 months, supporting counterterrorism operations against networks that threatened regional stability and American interests. The mission would require the kind of complex coordination between intelligence collection, precision fires, and civilian protection that had characterized Elena's most challenging assignments throughout her career. But Elena approached the deployment with confidence born from experience, supported by a marriage that could withstand extended separation, and guided by professional expertise that had been tested under the most demanding conditions. She understood the costs of military service but also appreciated the unique satisfactions that came from contributing to missions that mattered on a global scale. Elena's office at Fort Bragg displayed the accumulated symbols of a distinguished military career: awards and decorations that recognized exceptional service, photographs that documented deployments and achievements, and personal mementos that maintained connections to family and civilian life. But the most prominent item remained the photograph of Maria's wedding, now accompanied by pictures of her own wedding and family gatherings that showed the evolution of relationships that had survived the challenges of military life. 10 years later, Colonel Elena Vasquez stood on the observation deck of the Pentagon, looking across the Potomac River toward Arlington National Cemetery, where so many of her fellow soldiers had found their final rest. Her assignment to the Joint Staff represented the pinnacle of military career progression, a position that would influence national security policy and strategic planning for years to come. The briefing she had just delivered to the Joint Chiefs of Staff addressed lessons learned from a decade of counterterrorism operations, emphasizing the importance of human intelligence, precision fires, and adaptive leadership in complex operational environments. Her recommendations would shape doctrine, training, and resource allocation decisions that would affect thousands of soldiers and the success of future missions. Elena's journey from forward observer to strategic planner reflected the military's recognition that tactical expertise provided essential foundation for effective strategic thinking. Officers who had made life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure brought perspectives that couldn't be replicated through academic study or theoretical analysis. But Elena also understood that her current position carried responsibility for decisions that would affect not just individual soldiers, but entire populations and international relationships. The precision fires that she had once called in tactical situations were now part of strategic calculations that involved diplomatic consequences, economic implications, and long-term regional stability. Elena's home in Virginia reflected the stability that had characterized the later stages of her military career. She and David had built a life that balanced demanding professional responsibilities with family relationships and civilian connections that provided meaning beyond military service. Their children, now teenagers, understood their parents' profession while developing their own interests and goals that might or might not include military service. Maria's children often visited during school breaks, creating extended family gatherings that bridged military and civilian perspectives. Elena valued these occasions because they reminded her of the world that military service was intended to protect. The peaceful civilian life that most Americans took for granted, but that required constant vigilance and sacrifice to maintain. Aunt Elena, do you ever regret choosing the military instead of having a normal life? Asked Maria's daughter Jessica during one family dinner, displaying the kind of direct curiosity that teenagers brought to complex questions. Elena considered the question carefully, understanding that her answer would influence a young person's developing understanding of service, sacrifice, and career choices. Jessica, military service has been challenging in ways that I couldn't have anticipated when I was your age, but it has also provided opportunities to contribute to something larger than individual success, and to work with people who share commitment to values that matter beyond personal benefit. Elena paused, thinking about the soldiers she had led, the missions she had accomplished, and the relationships that had been forged through shared service and mutual sacrifice. I chose a profession that required giving up some things that other people value, but I gained experiences and relationships that I wouldn't trade for any conventional career. Elena's evening routine included reading intelligence summaries that kept her informed about global security challenges, communicating with former subordinates who were now leading their own units, and maintaining the professional relationships that made complex military operations possible. But her routine also included conversations with family, civilian friends, and community organizations that reminded her of the broader society that military service was designed to protect. 15 years later, Brigadier General Elena Vasquez delivered her final lecture at the National War College, addressing a class of senior officers and civilian officials who would shape American security policy for the next decade. Her presentation focused on the integration of tactical excellence with strategic vision, emphasizing that effective military leadership required understanding of both immediate operational requirements and long-term political objectives. The challenges we face as a nation require military leaders who can think beyond conventional warfare while maintaining the tactical expertise that ensures mission success, Elena told her audience. Future conflicts will be won by leaders who understand technology, culture, diplomacy, and economics, as well as they understand weapons systems and tactical doctrine. Elena's retirement ceremony took place at Fort Myer, Virginia, with hundreds of current and former colleagues in attendance to honor a career that had spanned multiple conflicts and influenced military development across all service branches. The ceremony included presentations from senior government officials, former subordinates who had achieved their own distinguished careers, and family members who had supported Elena's service despite its challenges and demands. During her retirement speech, Elena reflected on the changes she had witnessed in military service, the evolution of warfare, and the constant requirements for adaptation and innovation that characterized effective military organizations. Military service is ultimately about people, the soldiers we lead, the civilians we protect, and the families who support our mission through their own sacrifices, Elena said. Technology will continue to evolve, threats will change, and tactical requirements will adapt, but the fundamental purpose of military service remains constant: to preserve the freedom and security that allow democratic societies to flourish. Elena's post-military career included consulting work with defense contractors, teaching positions at civilian universities, and volunteer work with organizations supporting military families and veterans. But she also pursued interests that had been deferred during active duty: travel for pleasure rather than deployment, hobbies that had no tactical application, and relationships that existed entirely outside military communities. Elena and David purchased a small ranch in Montana, where they raised horses and welcomed visits from their children, grandchildren, and the extended military family that had been created through decades of shared service. The ranch provided perspective on the natural world that had often been obscured by focus on human conflict and technological complexity. Elena's home office contained the accumulated documentation of a distinguished military career, awards, photographs, maps, and personal mementos that told the story of service that had spanned multiple decades and continents. But the most treasured items remained the letters from soldiers she had trained and led, updates on their careers and families, and evidence that her influence had extended through generations of military service. 20 years after the Korangal Valley, Elena Vasquez Rodriguez stood at the grave of Marcus Chen, the young soldier who had shared her ordeal behind enemy lines, and whose trust had helped sustain her through 72 hours that changed her life. Marcus had been killed in action during his third deployment, leading a squad in Syria with the same courage and competence that had characterized his service in Afghanistan. The funeral had brought together soldiers from multiple generations, Elena's former subordinates, who were now senior leaders themselves, and family members who represented the civilian communities that military service was designed to protect. Elena had delivered the eulogy, speaking about Marcus's character, his dedication to his fellow soldiers, and the legacy of service that continued through the people he had influenced. Marcus understood that military service is not about individual heroism but about collective commitment to values that transcend personal interest, Elena had told the assembled mourners. He died as he lived, putting the welfare of his soldiers above his own safety and maintaining the standards of excellence that define the American military. Elena's reflection at Marcus's grave included gratitude for the relationship that had shaped both their lives, regret for the loss of someone whose potential had been cut short by violence, and determination to honor his memory through continued service to the military community and the values they had shared. Elena's current work included writing a memoir that would document her experiences while providing insights for future military leaders facing similar challenges. The book would address tactical lessons, leadership principles, and the psychological demands of military service while protecting classified information and respecting the privacy of people who had shared her experiences. But Elena's memoir would also explore the personal costs and rewards of military service, the challenges of maintaining family relationships while pursuing demanding careers, and the ongoing process of integrating military experiences with civilian life. These were topics that military literature often avoided, but that were essential for understanding the complete reality of military service. Elena's final chapter addressed young people considering military service, offering honest assessment of both opportunities and challenges, while emphasizing that military service remained one of the most meaningful ways to contribute to something larger than individual success. "Military service will test you in ways that cannot be simulated or imagined," Elena wrote. "It will require sacrifices that may seem disproportionate to any individual reward, but it will also provide opportunities to develop capabilities, form relationships, and contribute to missions that matter on a global scale. The decision to serve must be made carefully, but those who choose this path with clear understanding of its demands will find rewards that last a lifetime." Elena's book concluded with reflection on the photograph that had accompanied her through deployment, combat, and career progression. Maria's wedding picture had become a symbol of relationships that transcended military service, connections that provided meaning beyond professional accomplishment, and the civilian life that military service was designed to protect. The photograph that survived artillery fire in the Korangal Valley reminds me that military service derives its meaning from the people and values we serve to protect, Elena wrote. "Individual courage and tactical expertise are important, but they matter only insofar as they contribute to the larger purpose of preserving the freedom and security that allow societies to flourish." Elena's memoir became a bestseller that influenced military training, civilian understanding of military service, and policy discussions about the role of armed forces in democratic societies. But more importantly, it provided guidance and inspiration for young people facing decisions about service, sacrifice, and the meaning of citizenship in a complex and dangerous world. Elena's legacy lived on through the soldiers she had trained, the doctrine she had helped develop, and the example she had set for integrating tactical excellence with strategic vision and personal integrity. Her influence extended through generations of military leaders, who carried forward the lessons learned in Afghanistan's mountains and applied them to challenges that Elena could never have anticipated. 30 years later, Elena Vasquez Rodriguez sat in her rocking chair on the front porch of her Montana ranch, watching her great-grandchildren play in the yard while their parents, some military, some civilian, shared stories and laughter that bridged generational differences and professional boundaries. The photograph of Maria's wedding, now faded but still recognizable, occupied a place of honor on the mantel inside the house. Elena's granddaughter, Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez, had recently returned from her own deployment to Africa, where she had led a forward observer team with distinction that reminded family members of Elena's early career. Sarah had requested Elena's advice about career decisions, leadership challenges, and the ongoing process of balancing military service with personal relationships. "Grandma Elena, how did you know when you had accomplished enough to be satisfied with your military career?" Sarah asked during one of their evening conversations on the porch. Elena smiled, remembering similar questions she had asked her own mentors, and the gradual understanding that military service was not about achieving specific goals, but about contributing to an ongoing mission that required generational commitment. "Sarah, I learned that military service is not something you complete, but something you contribute to for as long as you're able," Elena replied. "Individual careers end, but the mission continues through the people you train, the example you set, and the values you uphold." Elena's influence on military doctrine, training, and culture had become part of institutional knowledge that shaped how the Army approached complex operations, leadership development, and the integration of tactical expertise with strategic thinking. Her innovations had been codified in field manuals, incorporated into educational curricula, and adapted to technologies and threats that had not existed during her active service. But Elena's most important legacy lived in the relationships she had formed and the people she had influenced throughout her career. Former subordinates had become general officers, training specialists, and civilian leaders who carried forward lessons learned during deployments and exercises under Elena's leadership. Elena's final public appearance was at the dedication of the Elena Vasquez Leadership Center at Fort Leavenworth, a facility that would provide advanced training for officers preparing for complex operational environments. The ceremony included speeches from senior military officials, former colleagues, and family members who had supported Elena's service throughout her career. General Vasquez exemplified the kind of leadership that our military requires. Tactical competence combined with strategic vision, personal courage balanced with institutional loyalty, and individual excellence integrated with team success, said the Chief of Staff of the Army during the dedication ceremony. Elena's response was brief, but reflected the perspective that came from decades of service and years of reflection on the meaning and purpose of military life. This facility represents not my individual achievements but the collective wisdom of generations of soldiers who have faced impossible challenges with courage, creativity, and commitment to something larger than personal success, Elena said. Future leaders who train here will face threats and opportunities that we cannot imagine, but they will do so with the foundation of values and skills that have sustained our military through every challenge our nation has faced. Elena spent her final years writing letters to young military officers, providing mentorship and guidance through correspondence that bridged generational differences and shared the insights that came from a lifetime of military service. These letters became treasured possessions for recipients who understood that they were receiving wisdom from someone who had faced the ultimate tests of military leadership and emerged with both professional success and personal integrity intact. Elena's last letter, written to her great-granddaughter who was considering military service, summarized the lessons of a lifetime spent in service to something larger than individual achievement. Military service will ask everything of you and give you everything in return, Elena wrote. You will face challenges that test your courage, decisions that define your character, and relationships that last beyond any individual career. Choose this path only if you understand that it leads not to personal glory but to the satisfaction of contributing to the security and freedom that allow others to pursue their own dreams in peace. Elena Vasquez Rodriguez died peacefully at her ranch, surrounded by family members who represented both military and civilian traditions, having lived long enough to see her influence extend through multiple generations of soldiers and the countless civilians whose freedom and security her service had helped preserve. At her funeral, the photograph of Maria's wedding was displayed alongside images that documented Elena's military career, family relationships, and the extended community of soldiers and civilians whose lives had been touched by her service. The photograph had survived artillery fire in Afghanistan, career transitions, family celebrations, and the passage of decades to become a symbol of relationships that transcended individual achievement and connected personal sacrifice to larger purposes. Elena's gravestone at Arlington National Cemetery bore the simple inscription that she had requested. She answered her country's call and honored the trust of those she led. But her true monument lived in the soldiers she had trained, the doctrine she had shaped, and the example she had set for integrating tactical excellence with strategic vision and personal integrity. The mountains of Afghanistan, where Elena had spent 72 hours that changed her life and influenced military development for decades to come, remained as they had been for centuries, harsh, beautiful, and indifferent to human ambition. But they had been touched by the presence of a soldier who understood that individual excellence meant nothing without collective commitment to values that transcended personal interest. Elena's legacy endured in the lives she had saved, the soldiers she had trained, the doctrine she had influenced, and the example she had set for future generations of military leaders who would face their own impossible challenges with the courage, competence, and character that Elena had demonstrated throughout her distinguished career. In the end, Elena Vasquez had kept the promise she made to herself during those desperate hours behind enemy lines. She had made her life count, had used her time with intention and purpose, and had honored the trust placed in her by the soldiers she led and the nation she served. Her story became part of the larger narrative of American military service, a testament to the capacity of individuals to rise to extraordinary challenges while maintaining the humanity and humility that made their service meaningful. Subscribe to channel name Where Silence Is Never Forgotten. Yed the radio one last time. Thunder Base, be advised. Targets have stopped and deployed. Adjust fire 200 meters west of original coordinates. Repeat, 200 meters west. Copy Falcon 7-7, adjusting fire. Time on target now 45 seconds. Elena pressed herself against the rock face and pulled Chen closer, shielding him with her body as much as possible. The enemy soldiers below were spreading out now, beginning their sweep toward the observation post ruins. She could see the green glow of night vision equipment, the deliberate movement of troops who knew exactly what they were looking for. 20 seconds. The silence before impact stretched like a held breath, pregnant with potential energy and inevitable violence. Elena found herself thinking about physics, about the precise calculations that would transform chemical explosives into targeted destruction, about the mathematics of trajectory and timing that would determine whether she lived or died in the next few moments. She had always been good with numbers, had considered studying engineering before choosing military service instead. 10 seconds. Elena closed her eyes and whispered a prayer that was part supplication, part promise. If she survived the next few minutes, she would make them count. She would use whatever time remained to her with intention and purpose. She would honor the trust that Chen and Williams had placed in her, the investment that her country had made in her training, the sacrifice that her family had accepted when she chose this path. 5 seconds. The first round impacted with the sound of thunder given physical form, a concussion that seemed to shake the mountains themselves. Elena felt the shockwave pass through her body, felt the rock face vibrate against her back like a living thing. The light was brilliant even through her closed eyelids, bright enough to create afterimages that would linger for hours. Then the second round hit, and the third, and suddenly the valley was alive with fire and metal and the screams of men caught in the open. But Elena's calculation had been perfect. The rounds landed exactly where they needed to, close enough to devastate the enemy formation while leaving her hiding spot intact. As the echoes faded and the smoke began to clear, she found herself alive, functional, and still in possession of the tools needed to complete her mission. The radio crackled with urgent voices, asking for battle damage assessment, requesting confirmation of target destruction, demanding to know her status. Elena keyed the handset and spoke in a voice that surprised her with its steadiness. "Thunderbase, this is Falcon 7-7. Good effects on target. Enemy convoy destroyed. Request medical evacuation for 3 wounded at my location. We're not done here yet." The response came immediately, filled with relief and professional admiration. "Outstanding work, Falcon 7-7. Medical evacuation en route. What's your ammunition status?" Elena looked at the laser rangefinder in her hands, at the encrypted communication equipment that still functioned despite the punishment it had absorbed, at the photograph of Maria that had somehow remained intact through the bombardment. She thought about the secondary weapons caches she had identified during her months of observation, about the supply routes that still needed to be interdicted, about the mission that was far from complete. "Thunderbase, I'm still mission capable. I have targets." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.